Chapter 5. The Search for a Self. I was puzzled at first by what seemed to me to be a lack of plan in Ouspensky's method of expounding G's system. Instead of completing a subject and then passing on to something else, he would repeatedly return to what he had dealt with earlier in order to add some details he had previously omitted. But I realized later that no plan was possible. In the first place, he was not delivering a series of formal lectures, but was answering questions as they arose in meetings, and, in the second place, everything in G's system was so closely interconnected with everything else that it was quite impossible to deal with anything in isolation. Because of this, we were compelled to pass backwards and forwards continually, for the discussion of a new subject frequently revealed some aspect of an old one which had not been dealt with, and this necessitated a re-examination of what had previously been said. After having drawn our attention to the extremely mechanical activities which help to keep man asleep, Ouspensky returned to man's many illusions about himself. One of the most cherished and most ridiculous of these illusions, he said, is that he possesses a permanent self, or master I, which imparts uniformity to his life and controls his various functions. But perhaps as the result of self-observation during the last few months, you have managed to get rid of this absurd idea about yourselves. You may have found out by now that there is no such thing within you as permanent I. Ouspensky then walked over to the blackboard and drew on it a circle which he proceeded to subdivide, by means of vertical and transverse lines, into a large number of small compartments, so that his final drawing resembled the picture of a bee's eye as seen under a high magnification. In each of the numerous facets of the eye he inscribed the capital letter I, and when he had finished his picture he went back to his chair. That, he announced, with the satisfaction of an artist who has completed a satisfactory portrait, is a picture of a man. He has not one eye, but innumerable eyes. They are continually replacing each other, one eye being there at one moment, and another eye at the next moment. Every thought and every feeling can and does claim to be I, until it has been pushed into the background and its place taken by another competitive I. Someone asked how it was that we had the very strong conviction that we did, in fact, possess both unity and permanence, and Ouspensky replied that there were two things which encouraged this idea. The first was that we possessed a single body, and the second that we went through life with a single and permanent name. It is true, he added, that our bodies change in the course of years, but they change so slowly that we do not notice it, and our names remain with us throughout our lives. These two stable things help to produce in us an illusion of permanence and unity, qualities which, if we observe ourselves a little more carefully, are found to be entirely non-existent. Not only does every thought, every feeling, every sensation in us claim the right to say I, but what is still more dangerous, it makes decisions for which the rest of us will later become responsible. For example, one reckless I may promise somebody to do something to which none of the other I's are likely to agree when the time has come for the fulfillment of the promise. Again, one group of I's in us happens to be interested in these ideas we are studying here, and may decide that it is very necessary to change, whereas others are not in the least interested in them and have no intention of changing anything at all. That is one of the difficulties you probably will have already noticed in your work, that you are seldom wholehearted in anything you do, and the reason why you are not wholehearted is that you are a plurality and not a unity. Man's name is Legion. The first discovery I had made from self-observation was how quickly changes occurred within me, one mood giving place to another and in turn yielding precedence to another. Nor was it only feelings which altered rapidly. I had also seen how an idea to which I had fully subscribed previously was liable to become quite unacceptable to me a little later. I had had glimpses of these changes and gross inconsistencies in me previously, but until I came into the work I had interpreted them as meaning that there existed some central core within them, some central core within me which was subject to certain alterations of mood and opinion. But here was Uspensky denying that there was anything central and permanent in me at all. According to him, the only thing I possessed of a durable nature was a name and a body, but was According to him, the only thing I possessed of a durable nature was a name and a body. But was this a reasonable way of looking at things? After thinking the matter over carefully, I first came to the conclusion that it did not matter very much which of the two ways of looking at myself I accepted, but later decided that G's way corresponded better with the facts as I saw them, for whereas I had no proof at all of the existence within me of any permanent thing which underwent changes, I had plenty of evidence of the existence in me of change itself. Still later I realized that the idea that man possessed no permanent self, but consisted only of change, always had been, and still was, a very widely held idea, and that one of the clearest formulations of this philosophy was to be found in the writings of that exceedingly perspicacious Scottish philosopher, David Hume. I looked up the passage in which he gives the account of his inability to find a permanent self, Book 1, Part 4, Section 4, and found that he had used it as an argument against Berkeley's claim that man possesses an intuitive knowledge of his own soul or self. Quote, "For my part, when I enter most intimately into what I call myself, I always stumble on some perception or other of heat or cold, light or shade, love or hatred, pain or pleasure. I never catch myself at any time without a perception. There may be philosophers," he ironically concludes, "who can perceive themselves, but setting aside some metaphysicians of this kind, I may venture to affirm of the rest of mankind that they are nothing but a bundle or collection of different perceptions, which succeed each other with inconceivably rapidity, and are in perpetual flux and movement." End quote. David Hume was a clear-sighted and unusually intelligent observer, and anyone who repeats his experiment with similar sincerity is likely to come to the same conclusions as he did. On closer examination, the thing which we have previously taken to be a self always turns out to be nothing more than a sequence of perceptions, and surely this psychic procession within us, which never remains for one moment stationary, but is always on the move, is quite unworthy of being accepted as a permanent self or soul. This does not, of course, preclude the possibility of something else more lasting, existing beneath all the superficial layers of psychic rubbish we call ourselves. But what have our modern philosophers to say on the subject of Hume's denial of the existence of any self? In his History of Western Philosophy, Bertrand Russell makes the following cautious and non-committal comment on it. "It does not follow that there is no simple self. It only follows that we cannot know whether there is or not, and that the self, except as a bundle of perceptions, cannot enter into any part of our knowledge. This conclusion is important in metaphysics as getting rid of the last surviving use of substance. It is important in theology as abolishing all supposed knowledge of the soul. It is important to the analysis of knowledge, since it shows that the category of subject and object is not fundamental." From Bertrand Russell, A History of Western Philosophy. It must be borne in mind that Bertrand Russell is one of the philosophers, I quote his own words, who confess frankly that the human intellect is unable to find conclusive answers to many questions of profound importance to mankind, but who refuse to believe that there is some higher way of knowing by which we can discover truths hidden from science and the intellect. In other words, Bertrand Russell bids us be content with science as our guide, and warns us against asking unanswerable questions, amongst them the question whether or not man possesses a self or a soul. Ever since man was capable of thought, he has been seeking to know what Bertrand Russell proclaims as unknowable, and he will continue to reach out for knowledge beyond his grasp long after the particularly narrow school of philosophy to which Russell belongs has passed into oblivion. And let us hope that he will never be content to live, as Russell would have him live, on the thin gruel of scientific knowledge alone, for in him has been placed a hunger for larger truths than those of science. Finally, let it be noted that everything in this book is opposed to Bertrand Russell's assertion that there are no ways of knowing things other than by the way followed by the scientists. A survey of the sacred books of the East shows us that the idea of the non-existence of any self has been held by the Buddhists for thousands of years. To Buddhists, David Hume's observations about the absence of anything a man can call a self present no difficulty at all. On the contrary, Hume's statement is entirely in line with their own teaching. Gautama Buddha is reputed to have said, "There are the petals, the pollen, the corolla, and the stalk. But there is no lotus flower. There is this or that passing idea, this or that transitory emotion, this or that image, but no organized whole behind them which can be called the ego or the self." The Buddhist uses the words ego and self merely as convenient terms for describing a changing combination of both physical and psychic phenomenon. He realizes that everything within himself is dependent on something else, and that nowhere is there anything which exists in its own right, independent and self-produced, unconnected with anything else, a veritable I. This belief is illustrated by a Tibetan parable which gives an excellent account of the Buddhist's view of a person. Madame David Neal narrates this parable in her well-known work on Buddhism. "A person," she writes, "is an assembly composed of a number of members. In this assembly, discussion never ceases. Now and again one of the members rises, makes a speech, and suggests an action. His colleagues approve, and it is decided that what he has proposed shall be executed. Often several members of the assembly rise at the same time and propose different things, and each of them, for private reasons, supports his own proposal. It may happen that these differences of opinion, and the passion which each of the orators brings to the debate, will provoke a quarrel, even a violent quarrel, in the assembly. Fellow members may even come to blows. It also happens that some of the members of the assembly leave it of their own accord. Others are pushed out, and others again are expelled by force by their colleagues. All this time newcomers introduce themselves into the assembly, either by gently sidling in or by forcing the doors. Such is man." The parable gives a very full account of our inner state. It goes on to describe how many of the voices heard at the meeting become more feeble in the course of time, whilst others become stronger and bolder, shouting down all opposition, and finally establishing their ascendancy over all rivals. "These," comments Madame David Neal, "are our instincts, our tendencies, our ideas, our beliefs, our desires, etc. Through the causes which engendered in it, each of them is the descendant and heir of many lines of causes, of many series of phenomena going far back into the past, and whose traces are lost in the shadowy depths of eternity." From Alexandra David Neal, Buddhism. Buddha taught that man was carried headlong through life as a log is borne along by a river in flood, and that he was particularly at the mercy of the triple currents of raga, that is passion, dosa, which is anger, and moha, which is illusion. The term nirvana, which is so constantly misunderstood by Westerners, really means the inner freedom which a man may eventually attain if, after prolonged struggle, he manages to disengage himself from all the compulsions and desires which formerly controlled him. In other words, nirvana represents the fulfillment of the promise long ago given by Buddha to his disciples. The promise contained in the words, "When thou hast understood the dissolution of all the fabrications, thou shalt understand that which is not fabricated." The similarity between Buddha's teaching and the ideas we were learning from Ouspensky was obviously a very close one. We had been told that impressions from without acted on us as a driving belt acted on a lathe, and that if this propelling force were similarly to cease, and at the same time the memories of similar past impressions were to fade, we should be immobilized and quickly die. This implied that none of our activities came from ourselves. but that they were always the result of forces originating outside, so that they were reactions rather than actions. But what, someone asked, was the thing in us which went through the pantomime of deciding what we should do, the thing in ourselves which we had previously called our will? Ouspensky replied that this so-called will of ours was nothing more than the resultant of our various desires, and what made the situation more confusing was the fact that, whenever we did anything, we could always claim afterwards, and with correctness, that we had acted in accordance with what we had wanted to do. This was true, but it only put the motive force to which we were reacting a little further back. We had acted as our wishes had dictated, but we had had little or no say in the acquirement of these desires, and this was entirely in keeping with the realistic teaching of Buddha that a man was the slave of his desires. But to assert that man is moved by external forces, as a lathe is moved by the workshop driving belt, does not necessarily exclude all possibility of choice for him. According to G's teaching, mechanical man does in fact possess a small measure of choice, so that he can choose to react to this or to that, but to call anything so restricted and so fleeting as this free will is obviously absurd. So, also, when the question of man's will is looked at from a larger standpoint, would it be absurd to imagine that Voltaire's little forked animal, living in a universe entirely governed by law, should be free to behave himself exactly as he pleased? Man, like the universe around him, is bound by laws and will always be bound by laws. Nevertheless, he is able to choose, to a limited and to an ever-increasing extent, the influences under which he prefers to live. Up till now, Ouspensky had spoken to us very little about the universe, but at a previous meeting he had mentioned that man lived under a number of different influences, reaching him from many different sources, such as the sun, the moon, and the planets. He had said that G taught that all these influences acted on man simultaneously, one kind predominating at one moment and another at another moment. Man could continue to react blindly as he had hitherto reacted to the various physiological drives and desires of his body, or, if he saw the necessity for doing this, he could begin to struggle with these blind urges and could seek to develop the higher parts of his nature. For man was a very complicated organism, and so constituted that there were many different things in him belonging to different levels of being. This statement about man evoked at a subsequent meeting the following question: how, if man is only a machine, can he have any choice in the matter? Ouspensky answered this question by saying that although man was a machine, there were certain weak places in his machinery where a certain amount of free play was possible between the various components of his mechanism. And it was in these weak places that a struggle to obtain control of himself could begin with some prospect of success. I have never found Ouspensky's metaphor of weak places in machinery at which work can start a very satisfactory one, and prefer another one, borrowed, I believe, from Spinoza, and adapted to serve my own purposes. I picture myself as seated in a frail canoe, which is being swept down a great river in the company of many similar canoes. I see myself taking careful note of the numerous eddies and currents of the river, and coming to some sort of decision as to the direction in which I want to travel. Then, having reached this decision, I imagine myself struggling, with the help of a small paddle, to nose my canoe into a current which I believe to be more favorable to this aim. I am quite aware of the fact that I shall inevitably be swept onwards by the river towards the sea, but I hope that by taking advantage of certain currents I shall travel more as I prefer to travel, and I do not entirely exclude the possibility that what I am doing may make some difference as to my final destination. The idea that man is compounded of many different principles, and that his real life function is to discover the godlike principle in his nature and to live in conformity with its laws, is to be found in all the great religions. The chief difference between the various religions is with regard to the nature of this higher principle in man. As has already been said, the Buddhist denies the existence in man of any separate self and argues that the only principle which he, personally, could accept as being real would be a homogeneous and self-engendered self, entirely independent of an external cause. Continuing this line of argument, the Buddhist adds that to be satisfying, a self would have to be eternal, for otherwise, if it had come into existence at a certain moment of time, it must have originated from some cause, and consequently could not be accepted as self-engendered. But there are other views on this important subject, and Shankara, the great Hindu commentator on the Vedanta, avoids all extremes and begins with the bold statement that the self is both known and unknown. We know, he says, that the self exists, but we do not know what it is, nor can we ever hope to know the self by means of thought, since thought is part of the flux of psychic states belonging to the region of the non-self. He then advises those who feel the need for some sort of idea of the self to picture it in terms of pure, undifferentiated consciousness, a consciousness which remains unaffected even when the body has been reduced to ashes and the mind has completely disappeared. As I see it, G's view of the self comes very close to, even if it does not coincide with, this Vedantist view of it. At any rate, a description of the self in terms of undifferentiated consciousness is the only description which I personally am able to accept at the present time. Whenever I turn my attention inwards and start to look for a self, I see what the Buddhist sees, namely a procession of perceptions, ideas and emotions, which come and go, and which are never there for very long. Like David Hume, I never catch anything which I can call my I. I can, of course, make a list of all the things I have seen as the result of self-observation, and can decide that all the thoughts and emotions of which I approve belong to my real self, whilst all the mean and shabby things I have noticed belong to my imaginary I or my false personality. But this is obviously cheating. I have no right to appropriate all the noble things in myself, and to discard all the mean, for they are all equally part of the highly complex creature known to the world as Kenneth Walker. There come seasons, meditative, sweet, yet awful hours, when in wonder and fear you ask yourself the unanswerable question, who am I? The thing that can say I, the world with its loud traffickings, retires into the distance, and through the paper hangings and stone walls and thick plied tissues of commerce and polity, and all the living and lifeless entanglements of society and a body, wherewith your existence sits surrounded, the sight reaches into the void deep, and you are alone with the universe, and silently commune with it as one mysterious presence with another. So wrote Carlyle, and it is obvious that, from the account he gives of his meditation, that he succeeded in penetrating only one of the several layers which separate him from the greater self. He managed for a moment or two to get past the noisy layer of the world's and his own loud traffickings, and to reach a quieter part of his being, but in the end it was only his own troublesome voice that he heard talking, for he continues with his reverie thus, who am I? What is this me? A voice, a motion, an appearance, some embodied, visualized idea in the eternal mind. Cogito ergo sum. Alas, alas, poor cogigator. This takes us but a little way. Sure enough, I am, and lately was not. But whence, how, where to? Carlyle was right at any rate in his conclusion that the thinker within us takes us only a little way. What he failed to understand was that it was this same restless thinker and talker which brought his self-remembering to an end and prevented him from learning anything more. There is a striking and highly significant difference between Carlyle's, the thinker's, and Tennyson's, the poet's, accounts of self-remembering. At the moment that Carlyle is starting to theorize about the nature of the self, Tennyson is making the age-old discovery that for truth to appear, the self of everyday life has to be dissolved in something immeasurably greater than itself. Quote, and yet no shadow of doubt but with clearness, and through loss of self, the gain of such large life as matched with ours, were sun to spark, unshadowable in words, themselves but shadows of a shadow. At that moment of larger life, pure unformulated experience displaced thought in Tennyson, and only afterwards was he able to find the words with which to describe what had happened. Had that busybody cogigator intervened at too early a moment, as it did in the case of Carlyle, everything would have been lost. All the great mystics call attention to the fact that the continuous turning of thought in the head is one of the greatest obstacles to the contemplative life. Jacob Boehm's instructions to the novice are couched in the language of religion, but they might equally well be given to a person who is trying to self-remember. He writes that the chief difficulty will come from associative thinking and the desires and requirements of the self of everyday life, or what he terms the willing of self. When thou standest still from the thinking of self and the willing of self, when both the intellect and will are quiet and passive to the impressions of the eternal world and spirit, and when thy soul is winged up and above what is temporal, the outward senses and the imagination being locked up by holy abstraction, then the eternal hearing, seeing and speaking will be revealed to thee, since it is not indeed but thine own hearing and willing that do hither thee, so that thou dost not see and hear God. That was from the Signature of All Things. The most exact accounts of the search for the self are, however, those given by Eastern writers, who liken the human mind to the waters of a lake and the seeker of the greater self to a man peering into the depths of the lake. According to the Vedantist philosopher, the mind has no intelligence or consciousness of its own, but borrows these from the nearby Atman or divine principle within man, in the same way that a crystal may borrow color from the proximity of a rose-colored object. Whenever an event or object in the external world is recorded within us by the special senses of vritti, or thought wave, is said to be raised in our minds, and our small ego sense, ahankara in Sanskrit, immediately identifies itself with this. We feel happy if the thought wave which the external event has raised within us happens to be of a pleasant nature, and unhappy if it remains to be unpleasant. And unhappy if it happens to be unpleasant. But the real self, or Atman, remains aloof from all these disturbances of the mind, since the Atman is by its very nature enlightened and free. It follows, therefore, that we shall never be able to know our real selves, so long as we are identified with the ego sense and with the thought waves by which we are ordinarily governed. It is only when we manage to free ourselves from these disturbances, and when the ruffled surface of the water becomes sufficiently calm, that we shall be able to discover what lies down there in the clear depths of the lake. Knowledge of this larger self is direct knowledge, as opposed to the indirect knowledge gained through the agency of the reason and the special senses. Being pure experience, it is beyond the range of argument, though arguments may subsequently arise when we are struggling to explain what has happened. Sometimes, and seemingly by accident, conditions are more favorable than usual for self-remembering, and when this happens and I draw near to the stillness of the center, I become more and more convinced that something much more permanent awaits me there, just beyond my reach. Yet, as I get a little closer to what I am seeking, I encounter a surprise, for instead of discovering, as I had expected to, an unmistakable I lying there in the untroubled depths, I find myself slowly disappearing into a nameless entity, immeasurably greater than myself. To claim that this higher realm of pure consciousness, bliss, and being, in which I am lost, is myself, would be preposterous, and yet I am of it, and it is of me. It is to this infinite realm of light, consciousness, and bliss that the Vedantist refers when he makes use of the word Sachidananda. Who am I, the thing that can say I? Surely this is the biggest question a man can ever put to himself. What will my friends, the psychological experts, make of this description of another state of being, of which Western psychology has nothing at all to say? Will my Jungian colleagues explain it as a sudden uprush of the collective unconscious into my own separate consciousness? Will my Freudian friends offer me a still less attractive interpretation of what I have experienced? I am not very deeply concerned with the way in which my words will be interpreted, but if it were necessary for me to find some sort of scientific support for them, I should not be at a loss. I should refer my critics to a physicist of international fame. Schrödinger writes, quote, "Consciousness is never experienced in the plural, only in the singular. How does the idea of plurality, so emphatically opposed by the Upanishad writers, arise at all? Consciousness finds itself intimately connected with and dependent on this physical state of a limited region of matter, the body. Now there is a great plurality of similar bodies. Hence the pluralization of consciousness of minds seems a very suggestive hypothesis. Probably all simple, ingenious people, as well as the great majority of Western philosophers, have accepted it. The only possible alternative is simply to keep the immediate experience that consciousness is a singular of which the plural is unknown, that there is only one thing, and that which seems to be a plurality is merely a series of different aspects of this one thing, produced by a deception, the Indian Maya. The same illusion is produced in a gallery of mirrors, and in the same way Gauri Sankar and Mount Everest turn out to be the same peak seen from different valleys." From E. Schrödinger, What is Life? The Bhagavad Gita sums this up in the words, "indivisible, but as if divided in beings." The approach to knowledge by way of the reason and the inner senses has brought invaluable results in our examination of the world outside ourselves. But it is useless in our present study of the inner world of consciousness and the self. Aurobindo gives his powerful support to this view, for he writes, quote, "So long as we confine ourselves to sense evidence and the physical consciousness, we can conceive nothing and know nothing except the material world and its phenomena. But certain faculties in us enable our mentality to arrive at conceptions which we may indeed deduce by ratiocination or by imaginative variation from the facts of the physical worlds as we see them, but which are not warranted by any purely physical data or any physical experience. It is fortunate that there exists in us these other faculties capable of correcting the errors made by the sense mind and of opening up new vistas of truth. It was to them that the maker of the Katha Upanishad was probably referring when he declared, "This secret self in all beings is not apparent, but it is seen by means of the supreme reason, the subtle, by those who have the subtle vision."